everyone, and welcome to PJR's webinar, the third in a four-part series on the IATF 16949 transition. Today I hope to get through most of Section 8 in the new standard. This is probably the most difficult and tedious part of the four-part series. Lots of requirements here, lots of detail, lots of technical stuff, so we'll try to get through as much as possible. Next Wednesday's webinar looks like it will be easier as I look ahead to that content. To ensure sound quality, all participants have been muted. This session is being recorded, and a copy of a digital recording of this webinar along with the slides will be available for download 24 to 48 hours from the conclusion of today's webinar. As participants are muted, if you have a question, please type it into the question feature, and I will do my best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Again, I hope to get through all of Section 8. If time looks like it will be prohibitive, I will at least get through Section 8 to 8.6. Okay, so let's get started in Section 8.1.1, which is Operational Planning and Control, Supplemental. And again, there's a legend with colored stars here that I reviewed on last week's webinar. So let's go back and review what those are. Red is a new requirement. The golden star is a modification of an existing requirement in TS 16949, and a blue star is basically a carryover. So 8.1.1 is a modification, and it talks about planning for product realization. This section features enhanced detail to ensure key processes are included and considered when planning for product realization. So what you need to consider is customer product requirements and technical specifications, logistics requirements, manufacturing feasibility, project planning, maybe an APQP process, and acceptance criteria. The section clarifies the resources needed to achieve conformity encompass all aspects of the development process, not just the manufacturing process. 8.1.2 is a carryover relative to confidentiality, minor editorial change here. Clarified confidentiality includes related product information instead of using the word and. No change in intent. 8.2.1.1 Customer Communication Supplemental. There's an added requirement here that the communication language, written or verbal, must be agreed with the customer. This should be considered when you determine the necessary competence for roles that require customer communication. Are you going to be using some type of EDI or computer-aided design data to communicate with your customer? If so, the people at the organization or supplier need to be competent in those tools. H2.2.1, determining the requirements for products and services, supplemental. Here, notes 2 and 3 in TS 16949 have been elevated from notes into requirements. The organization's knowledge regarding recycling, environmental impact, product and manufacturing process characteristics should be standardized. And this knowledge needs to be systematically reviewed and used when determining the requirements for the products and services offered to customers. In the standard, it further states that compliance to ISO 9001 822A shall include but not be limited to the following: all applicable government safety and environmental regulations related to acquisition, storage, handling, recycling, elimination, or disposal of material. (82311) review of the requirements for products and services, supplemental. The organization has to retain documented evidence of any customer authorized waivers for the 9001 requirement of 8231 for formal review. 82312, just a carryover. The organization shall conform to customer requirements for designation, approval documentation, and control of special characteristics. No change in intent here. 82313, organization manufacturing feasibility. Some enhanced requirements here. A multidisciplinary approach to analyze feasibility, considering all engineering and capacity requirements. That in and of itself isn't really new. A multidisciplinary approach should always be used. Feasibility analysis is needed for new manufacturing or any change or product technology, and for any change manufacturing process or design. The organization should validate their ability to make product specifications at the required rate, and obviously use the customer specified process for this validation. Okay, let's move into design and development of products and services. This is now in section 8.3 as opposed to 7.3. Design and development of product and services, supplemental. Here there is a new requirement: the organization shall document the design and development process. Brand new requirement here. So the process itself needs to be documented. A procedure, some type of process flow diagram, that is new. ISO 9001 section 831 shall apply to product and manufacturing process design and development with an emphasis on error prevention rather than detection. And that emphasis really has always been there. Big change here: document the design and development process. 8321, design and development planning, supplemental. So the supplements the ISO 9001 clause. The organization needs to ensure that design and development planning includes all the affected stakeholders within the organization and its supply chain. Examples of areas where a multidisciplinary approach should be used include the following: project management, so in your APQP, product and manufacturing process design activities, considering use of alternative designs and manufacturing processes, development and review of product design risk analysis, your DFIMAs, including what actions will be taken to reduce risks, development and review of manufacturing process risk analysis, your manufacturing FEMAs, and then other process documentation, process flows, control plans, and work instructions. Want to make sure we're including the organization's design, manufacturing, engineering, quality, production, purchasing, maintenance disciplines, as well as appropriate folks from within the supply chain. (8322), simply the addition of a note here to provide an example of a product design skill set. No change here. 8323, development of products with embedded software. I read these requirements and I think, boy, I'm glad I'm not a supplier dealing with a product with embedded software, and I certainly hope I'm not in a position where I have to audit product with embedded software. The organization has to use a process for quality assurance for their products with internally developed embedded software. They need to use some type of software development assessment methodology to assess the organization's software development process, which in and of itself is a huge task. The organization has to retain documented information of a software development capability self-assessment. One way to do this is to include it in the internal audit program. The internal auditor would need to be competent and understand and assess the effectiveness of the software development assessment methodology chosen by the organization. So a very unique set of skills for your internal auditor. Not only do they need to be competent as a management systems auditor, they really need to understand the software development assessment methodology that you're using. 8331, product design input. There's been an expansion in the minimum set of product design input requirements with the emphasis on regulatory and software requirements. Some of these new requirements include boundary and interface requirements, consideration of design alternatives, assessment of risks and the organization's ability to mitigate, manage risks, conformity targets for preservation, serviceability, health, safety, environmental and development timing, statutory and regulatory requirements for the country of destination, and embedded software requirements. This is now manufacturing process design input. Again, similar to product design input, an expansion of the list of process design inputs, including product design output data, including special characteristics, targets for productivity, process capability, timing and cost, new materials, product handling and ergonomic requirements, design for manufacturing and design for assembly. Manufacturing process design shall include the use of error-proofing methods. That's a note that's been moved to a new requirement. Special characteristics. Organization needs to use a multidisciplinary approach to establish, document, and implement its process to identify special characteristics, including special characteristics identified by the organization and the customer. So here there's a documentation requirement for the process to get your arms around and fully implement special characteristics. You need to make sure you're documenting special characteristics in drawings, including them in your risk analysis, such as your FEMA, including them in your control plans, operator instructions, drawings, getting customer approval where required, using the customer specified symbols or definitions, or the organization's own set of symbols with a defined symbol conversion table, and submit that to the customer if required. Here's what I call the hidden input to management review. Measurements at specified stages during the design and development of products and processes shall be defined, analyzed, and reported with summary results as an input to management review. I think now moving forward to where management review is in the standard in a later section that's now explicitly listed as a requirement, and it never actually was before, so that's good. I'm double checking that right now. Actually, it's not, which is a bit frustrating. So remember, a management review input is measurements at specified stages in your product or process design and development. Needs to be an input to management review. Reporting to the customer also has to include as required. And this can be accomplished in a variety of ways. Most common is the periodic update of APQP schedule milestones through a gated review process or open issues lists. 8342, design and development validation. Design and development validation has to be performed in accordance with customer requirements, any applicable industry, and government agency issued regulatory standards. The timing of validation activities needs to be in alignment with customer specified timing. And if there's an interface of the product with perhaps embedded software, or it's part of a final assembly, the validation needs to include that interface within the system of the final customer's product. (8343) relates to a prototype program. If it's required by the customer, the organization shall have a prototype program and a prototype control plan. Whenever possible, the same suppliers, tooling, and manufacturing processes will be used as used in production. If anything's outsourced, the organization shall include the type and extent of control and the scope of its quality management system to ensure that outsourced services conform to the requirements. And that's handled through purchasing. (8344), a product approval process. The organization has to establish, implement, and maintain the product and manufacturing approval process in accordance with customer requirements, whatever that process is. The organization has to apply this product approval process to its suppliers prior to submission of their part approval to the customer. The organization has to obtain documented product approval prior to shipment if required by the customer. 8351, design and development outputs. Here we have an expanded list of design and development outputs, including a recognition of the use of 3D models, inclusion of service parts and packaging, use of product design error-proofing methods, use of GD&T tolerancing and position systems, outputs could include repair and serviceability instructions and service part requirements that will be used by approved maintenance organizations. So really looking at 8351, very similar to what we saw for product design input and process design input requirements, an expanded list of requirements here. 8352, manufacturing process design output, needs to be documented in a format that enables verification against the manufacturing process design inputs. Again, an expanded list here, specifications and drawings, special characteristics, identification of process input variables and impact characteristics, maintenance plans and instructions, data for quality, reliability, maintainability, and measurability, results of error-proof identification and verification, methods of rapid detection, feedback, and correction of product manufacturing process nonconformities. (8361) Design and development changes. A strengthening of the requirement for change validation and approval prior to the implementation of any change. This also goes for embedded software. If required by the customer, the organization shall obtain documented approval or a documented waiver prior to production implementation. And if dealing with embedded software, the organization shall document the revision level of software and hardware as part of the change record to ensure configuration management. Okay, moving into 8.4, which is the old purchasing 7.4 in TS 16949. I'm getting some notes the audio is breaking up. I'll try to make an adjustment here. Supplemental to the 9001 requirements, clarifies that there's an expansion about what's included here. All products and services that affect customer requirements, including subassembly, sequencing, sorting, rework, calibration services, not just the raw materials and component parts. (8412) Supplier selection process. The organization needs to have a documented supplier selection process. So here there's a requirement for some type of documentation, a process flow or a procedure. This is new. The selection process needs to include the following. An assessment of the selected supplier's risk to product conformity and ensuring an uninterrupted supply of product to the organization's customers, the relevant quality and delivery performance, the organization's assessment of their QMS, multidisciplinary decision making, and an assessment of software development capabilities if applicable. They then list other supplier selection criteria that could be considered, the volume of automotive business they have, the financial stability of the supplier, the required technology, their capability, their change management process, their logistics, and customer service. So here the organization really needs to have a documented process for how they're selecting suppliers. Needs to be based on risk, and I really think that 8412A is important. Selected suppliers' risk to product conformity and ensuring an uninterrupted supply of the organization's product to their customers. 8413 clarifies that all of Section 8.4 will apply to customer-directed sources. The only thing that wouldn't apply is selection of the supplier itself, but everything else would apply to them. They're making that clear. 8421, supplementing the ISO 9001 requirements, type and extent of control, supplemental. Here there's a requirement for a documented process, procedure, a process flow chart, to identify outsourced processes and select the type and extent of controls used to verify conformity of the externally provided product, process, or service to both the organization and its final customers. The process should include criteria and actions to escalate or reduce the type and extent of controls, and development activities based on supplier performance and assessment of product, material, or service risks. This could also be covered maybe in a control plan. Here there's an implication of constant monitoring of performance and assessment of risk based on the established criteria, triggering the actions to escalate or increase and reduce the type and extent of control based on the supplier's performance. The organization has to have a process to ensure, a documented process, to ensure that purchased products, processes, and services conform to the current applicable statutory regulatory requirements in the country where the purchased products are received, where they're shipped, and in the customer identified country of destination if it's provided. If your customer defines special controls, the organization has to implement these requirements and cascade them down to their supplier regarding statutory regulatory requirements. 8423 is very interesting to me. It relates to supplier quality management system development. Previously talked about ISO 9001 certification by an accredited certification body. Here it talks about a stepwise approach to develop suppliers, starting with compliance to ISO 9001 through second-party audits, all the way through to certification IATF 16949 through third-party audits. So many of you are thinking, I can potentially get around having my suppliers certified to ISO 9001 by an accredited certification body. Potentially, yes, for suppliers, newer suppliers you're just starting to use. But remember, you need to be doing second-party audits of those, and we've previously talked about the requirements for second-party auditors, and those requirements are considerable. So it may be easier just to require the third-party ISO 9001 certification by an accredited CB. Again, there's clarification that that accredited certification body has to bear the accreditation mark of a recognized IAF MLA member and not be a accreditation issued by an accreditation body that really is meaningless, or where the accreditation body and certification body are related. (84231), very similar to organizations that have to implement a process for software quality assurance for their products. They have to require it for their suppliers as well. A software development assessment methodology has to be used to assess the supplier's software development process. (8424), the organization has to have a documented process and criteria to evaluate supplier performance. They give a list of performance indicators that should be monitored, and many of these aren't different than what was in TS 16949. Delivery product conformity to requirements, delivery schedule performance, customer disruptions at the receiving plant, including yard holds and stop shipments, and instances of premium freight. Potentially, if provided by the customer, special status, customer notifications, dealer returns, warranty, field actions, and recalls all need to be evaluated. So it's important to note that 8412 talks about the supplier selection process and having a documented process for that. Where many companies often struggle is their ongoing supplier monitoring. This is covered in 8424. You have to have a documented process for this, and you have to provide objective evidence that you're measuring and evaluating against these indicators. 84241, second party audits. This informs you that you need to be doing second party audits as part of your supplier development process. To be clear, as part of supplier management. So you can use these second party audits to assess risks in your suppliers, to monitor their ongoing performance, to develop new suppliers, or to conduct product and process audits. Again, these are costly. The competency requirements for second party auditors are considerable, so you need to use a risk-based approach. Consider product safety, regulatory requirements, the overall performance of the supplier, whether or not they're certified or not, and make strategic decisions about where you're going to do your second party audits. But rest assured, in IATF 16949 transition audit and ongoing audits thereafter, we're going to ask for evidence of you having done a second party audit. You need to show us you've done this. You need to maintain records of these audits. And use the automotive process approach. The organization shall determine the priority, type, extent, and timing of required supplier development actions for its active suppliers. Inputs to consider include performance issues related to supplier monitoring, second-party audit findings, whether or not they're third-party certified, and risk analysis. This slide talks about the development of short-term and long-term goals in your supplier development process. So short-term efforts should focus on conformity of products, and long-term efforts should focus on the development of the supplier's QMS to enhance their ability to provide conforming products in the long run, reducing risk. 8431, information for external providers. Organizations required to flow down key information to its supply chain, including applicable statutory and regulatory requirements and special product and process characteristics. Okay, moving through to section 8511, the control plan. Here we're seeing many IATF OEM customer-specific requirements now part of the IATF standard. There's been an elevation of a note regarding customer approval to a requirement, and a strengthening of the requirement that control plan review and update criteria should be linked to PFEMA updates. The control plan and PFEMA are living documents, and when one changes, the other should change. Control plans are needed for the relevant manufacturing site and all products supplied, not just for the final product or final assembly line. Family control plans are acceptable for bulk material or similar parts using a common manufacturing process, but exercise some care with this. Eight 8512 addresses work operator instructions. They need to be communicated to and understood by the employees who are responsible for performing the work. They need to be legible and in a language that they understand. They need to be accessible in the work area and include rules for operator safety. 8513 talks about verification of job setups. They need to verify job setups at the initial run of a job, material changeover, or any job change requiring a new setup. There needs to be documented information for setup personnel, use of statistical methods of verification, first off, last off part comparison. First off parts need to be retained for comparison with last off parts. Last off parts need to be retained for comparison with first off parts of subsequent runs, and record retention requirements. This is a new requirement, verification after shutdown. The organization has to define and implement the actions to be taken to ensure compliance with requirements after a planned or unplanned production shutdown. 8515, a new requirement for TPM, Total Productive Maintenance. The organization needs to develop, implement, and maintain a documented TPM system. The system needs to include, I'm looking at A through J in the standard, identification of the equipment that's included, availability of replacement parts, not necessarily new, provision of resources for maintenance, packaging and preservation, again not new, applicable customer-specific requirements, documented maintenance objectives. Here they suggest some. OEE, mean time between failure, mean time to repair. Regular review of the maintenance plan and objectives, and a documented action plan to address corrective action when these objectives aren't achieved. Use of preventive maintenance and predictive maintenance. Many companies struggle with predictive maintenance, and periodic overhaul. (8516) addresses production tooling and IM&TE. Again, a clarification, strengthen tooling and equipment marking and tracking features. Customer-owned tools, manufacturing equipment, test inspection equipment need to be permanently marked in a visible location so that ownership and application of each item can be determined. The scope has been extended to production and service material and for bulk materials. And updates clarify that the system for production tooling management must include tool design modification documentation and tool identification information. Production scheduling, again a clarification. The organization needs to use a process to ensure that production is scheduled in order to meet customer orders demands, such as a JIT system, with that access to an information system that permits getting your arms around production information at key stages of the process. Needs to be order driven. There's a suggestion the organization needs a robust feasibility review process regarding production scheduling. Inclusion of all relevant planning information is inputs to the feasibility review and making any necessary adjustments in real time. (8521) Identification and Traceability Supplemental. Really nothing above ISO 9001 here. Strengthening of the requirement for traceability to support industry lessons learned related to field issues. And there's a requirement for clear start and stop points for product received by the customer. Is aligned with the definition of traceability in 9000-2015. And to be clear, clear start and stop points relate to product received by the customer that may contain quality or safety-related nonconformities. (8541) Preservation Supplemental. Clarification here, specifically in addition to specificity to preservation controls, and includes application to internal or external providers. Preservation activities have been expanded in two ways. One, in the activities that are considered preservation controls, and two, locations where preservation controls apply. Examples include the preservation of identification during the product's shelf life, a contamination control program appropriate to identified risks, design and development of robust packaging and storage areas, transmission and transportation considerations, and measures to protect product integrity. Feedback of information from service. This section has been expanded from the ISO TS 16949 requirement, featuring an expanded scope to include material handling and logistics. There's a second new note that clarifies that service concerns should include the results of field failure test analysis where applicable. The intent and the reason behind this is to ensure that the organization is aware of nonconformities that occur outside of its organization. This section clarifies that service centers need to comply with all applicable customer requirements when there's a service agreement with the customer. The organization needs to verify that the relevant service centers comply with applicable requirements, verifying the effectiveness of special purpose tools or measurement equipment, and ensuring that all service personnel are trained in applicable requirements. (8561) Control of Changes Supplemental. Here there's a requirement for a documented process to control and react to changes that impact product realization. Changes can be caused by the organization, customers, or suppliers. This process needs to define validation and verification activities that need to be taken, needs to ensure validation of changes before implementation, a documentation of any risk analysis done, and retention of records. FEMAs need to be reviewed and updated as appropriate, and production trial run activities should be planned based on the risk and complexity of the change. (8561) I think is maybe one of the most significant changes and additions in the standard, a temporary change of process controls. The organization needs to identify, document, and maintain a list of the process controls, including inspection, measuring, test, and error-proofing systems that include the primary process control and the approved backup or alternate method. So your control plan may specify the use of an automated nut driver, and it also needs to detail the appropriate backup or alternate method, maybe a manual torque wrench. So I've asked for and received clarification that the scope of this needs to include essentially any inspection, measuring, or test or error proofing that's part of your control plan. So you need a backup method. That backup method needs to be documented somehow. I would think the control plan is the most logical place to do this. The use of alternative control methods is considered a process. Therefore, the organization is expected to manage these activities appropriately. What does management mean? You need work instructions available for each alternate process control method. The organization shall review the operation of alternate process controls on a daily basis at minimum to verify the implementation of standard work with the goal to return to the standard process as soon as possible. This could be done through layered process audits or meetings or focused audits. Restart verification is documented for a defined period based on severity and confirmation that all features of the error-proofing device or process are effectively reinstated. The organization needs to implement traceability of all product produced with any alternate process control devices or processes being used. This is, I think, one of the biggest changes in the standard because it applies to every single inspection, measurement, test, or error-proofing device that's currently part of your process and coming up with an acceptable backup method. And then when those backup methods are used, managing them appropriately, having standard work instructions, doing daily layered process audits to make sure that they're effective, and ensuring traceability of all product produced, with this alternate process control device or method. Okay, folks, now based on time, we're now at section 8.6. I'm going to stop here and we'll pick up sections 8.6.1 through sections 9 and 10 next time in the 329 webinar. We've received a lot of questions. I'm now going to go through as many of those as possible. Okay, question about customer-specific requirements. What's the best process in order to extract the definitive customer-specific requirements? For instance, we have a customer who has a supplier requirements manual and no notation in the manual for IATF CSRs. With no notation in the manual, how do you determine what would be covered under the scope of the CSRs? Again, remember, there is a requirement that you need to determine and document where your system addresses all the customer-specific requirements. So the person that posed this question, when you say no notation in the manual for IATF 16949 CSRs, I don't know if that means your manual. I'm guessing that it does. But remember that there is a requirement in the standard for you to address where your organization's quality management system addresses customer-specific requirements, and that's 7511D. Second-party auditor competency requirements. I'm getting a question about those and where those can be found in the standard. Those are in section 724. Many of the second-party auditor competency requirements are similar to internal auditor competency requirements. Today we talked about the new requirement for conducting second-party audits. You have to do them. Use a risk-based approach to select where it's most appropriate to do them, and people doing them have to meet the requirements of 724. The new standard does not make exceptions for small supplier designations, Lisa. Robert 85611, the last section I talked about today, yes, you have to have a backup for everything. Every Let me go back to that particular section. 85611. Maintain a list of the process controls, including inspection, measuring, test, and error-proofing devices. You need to include the primary process control and the approved backup or alternate method. This means everything on your control plan. Getting a question about where statutory and regulatory requirements can be found, often flow down by your customers in their terms and conditions documents. You may be doing your own analysis of applicable statutory regulatory requirements. There isn't a magic easy place. You have to do some digging and ensure you have a robust process handy to make sure you have your arms around all the applicable statutory regulatory requirements. Andy, I'm sorry, I have no update on when the Ford CSRs will be available on the IATF website. Getting a specific question about 8425, let's go there. Again, Section 8.4 is the new purchasing, supplier development. I'm going to read the question. Will this mean the customer audits will be mandatory to suppliers? Not really sure what you mean, Manuel. If you want to provide some clarification. Essentially, just to clarify what 8425 is telling us, organizations have to prioritize their supplier development actions for the suppliers they're using. In any organization, you have to make good business decisions, and there's a finite amount of resources, money, and people to go around. So you have to make strategic decisions. So you want to, spend time and money with suppliers that cause the greatest risk. And how you're going to know that is through your supplier monitoring activities, your second-party audits, whether or not they're third-party certified, etc. I hope that answers your question. Okay, somebody's asking if our customer sends prints and designs the product, so you can exclude the product design requirements of Section 8.3, Tim. So that might include 8331. It may also include 8351, but it cannot include, very similar to TS 16949, anything related to manufacturing process design output. There might be other requirements that can be excluded. You'll have to go through that exercise yourself. No, Lisa, the new standard does not require all suppliers to be IATF certified. If you look at Section 8423, it gives a kind of a progressive approach to supplier development, starting with compliance to ISO 9001 through second-party audits, certification to ISO 9001 through third-party audits, certification to ISO 9001 with compliance to customer-defined sub-tier QMS requirements, certification to 9001 and compliance to IATF 16949, followed by certification to IATF 16949 through third-party audits. So it's not saying that all suppliers have to be IATF 16949 certified, no. Going to wait to see if any other questions come in. Getting a question, up to what extent can we expect the organization to use TPM concept? I'm sorry, this question isn't clear to me. I know we're talking about 8415, total productive maintenance. You need to be meeting all the requirements of 8515, identification of equipment, availability of replacement parts, use of predictive and preventive maintenance methods, certain documented maintenance objectives, action plans where those objectives aren't met. All of those have to be part of your TPM system. Vimal, please provide clarification if I didn't answer your question. Tim's asking, do I have to redo all our work instructions to include a paragraph for operator safety if there was none before based on 8512? So looking at 8512, Tim, there's a sentence at the bottom that says the standardized work instruction shall include rules for operator safety. So if your current work instructions have no operator safety requirements, use of glasses or gloves or any ergonomic best practices are suggested, they need to be revised to include them. And it appears that in your case that needs to include all your work instructions. Request to clarify validation of first off and last off parts. This relates to setup requirements, and we saw this in 8.5. Covered in 8513D. First off parts should be retained for comparison with last off parts from a given production run, and the last off part from that production run should be retained for comparison with the first off part from a subsequent run. I hope I'm answering your question, Bimal. Okay, folks, we're at the noon hour. Oh, getting a couple more questions. Interesting question from Dorothy. If the safety requirements are the same shop-wide, can I just create a safety work instruction instead of changing each individual work instruction? That may or may not work, Dorothy. It certainly is a possibility as long as that was available and accessible by your operators in the same way that the standard operator instructions are accessible. Getting a clarification on an earlier question on customer-specific requirements. When there's no notation in my company's supplier requirements manual for IATF CSRs, I'm trying to determine what is or is not a customer-specific requirement when there's no notation. I guess I wouldn't expect any company supplier requirement to go to this level. I mean, if a company's flowing down a set of supplier requirements, those are your customer-specific requirements that you need to comply with. And you need to show, per 7.5, where in your system you're addressing those requirements. And 7.5 suggests a matrix. And to be clear, that is in 7.5.11D. Okay, folks, I thank you for your time today. There'll be time on next week's webinar if there are any additional questions on sections 8.1 through 8.6. Again, a copy of today's slides and a digital recording will be accessible from our website, www.pjr.com, within about 24 to 48 hours. Thank you.